In the bustling streets of ancient Alexandria, a city where the sea met the desert and cultures collided, one figure rose above the noise of merchants, priests, and politicians. She was neither a queen nor a warrior, yet her presence commanded respect greater than many rulers of her time. Imagine a woman stepping into crowded lecture halls, her voice carrying not only across the marble walls of the city, but across centuries. Her name was Hypatia, the philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer who dared to live by reason in an age when passion and zeal ruled the streets. Her life unfolded during one of history's most volatile moments, a period when religions clashed, politics turned brutal, and the very survival of free thought hung in the balance. Hypatia did not hide in safety. She walked openly into the public square, teaching the mysteries of numbers, the order of the stars, and the questions of the soul. Students of every background came to her, drawn not just to her knowledge, but to her fearless pursuit of truth. Yet that very courage made her a target. To some, she was a light of wisdom. To others, a dangerous obstacle standing in the way of power. What makes her story haunting and unforgettable is not only her genius, but the price she paid for it. Hypatia's life reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge has never been safe, and that those who challenge the boundaries of ignorance often face the harshest resistance. Her legacy, however, survived the violence meant to silence her, becoming a symbol of courage, freedom, and the timeless fight between reason and fanaticism. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. In this video, we are diving deep into the extraordinary story of Hypatia of Alexandria, exploring her brilliance, her influence, and why her legacy still matters today. The great city of Alexandria was never simply a collection of stone walls, bustling streets, or crowded marketplaces. It was an idea, a living symbol of what human thought could achieve when given the freedom to breathe. The sea met the land with a quiet certainty, and the city rose as if it had always been destined to carry within its walls the pulse of discovery and the weight of dreams. For centuries, it held a library that seemed to mirror the very heavens, gathering the words of nations, the teachings of philosophers, the calculations of mathematicians, and the visions of poets. In such a place, knowledge was not just guarded but celebrated. It was alive. Yet, as much as Alexandria was remembered for its towering lighthouse or the grandeur of its harbor, it was also remembered for voices often forgotten, voices that dared to echo in the midst of male-dominated discourse. In this landscape of ideas and power, women were expected to stand at the margins. Their presence was often acknowledged only in households, rituals, and in roles tethered to family and tradition. To walk into spaces of learning, to speak with authority, or to leave behind writings of their own was not what society readily permitted. Still, exceptions existed, rare yet striking, like sparks in the dark. And in the heart of Alexandria, one such exception would rise to brilliance, not as a mere echo of her father or her teachers, but as a voice entirely her own. She was a woman who would not only inherit a legacy of knowledge, but also extend it beyond its limits, reshaping what wisdom could mean in her time. Her story begins not in isolation but in connection, with a father who recognized her potential and refused to confine her to the silence expected of her gender. He taught her mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, disciplines that many believed lay outside the reach of women. To him, she was not simply a daughter to be married away, but a mind to be cultivated. This bond of trust and respect planted the seed for what she would later become: a teacher, a philosopher, and a beacon of reason. Yet it was not only a personal story of father and child. It was also a story about the intellectual climate of Alexandria, where, despite the political turmoil of shifting empires and the looming shadow of conflict, the pursuit of learning still held power. Knowledge was a refuge, a form of resistance, and for her, a path into immortality. As she grew, the city around her reflected both brilliance and fragility. Alexandria was a place where Greek heritage mixed with Egyptian traditions, where Roman influence clashed with older beliefs, and where new religions were beginning to shape the identity of communities. The public squares carried debates that were often less about agreement and more about the endurance of thought. It was in this storm of competing ideas that her mind found clarity. To be heard in such a setting required not only intelligence but courage, for the spaces of philosophy were often guarded with jealousy by men who believed reason belonged only to them. Yet she walked into these spaces, not hidden nor hesitant, but with a presence that demanded recognition. What set her apart was not only her mastery of mathematics or the elegance of her lectures, but her ability to bridge. She stood at the crossing of old wisdom and new interpretations, at a moment when the world itself seemed caught between fading traditions and rising beliefs. Her words were not abstract whispers. They were practical, clear, and alive with conviction. Students gathered to listen, not merely because she was unusual as a woman who taught, but because she was compelling. Her clarity in thought gave her authority, and her character gave her influence. She did not chase power, yet power sought her because truth often commands it without intention. But every life lived in brilliance casts shadows. Alexandria was not free from strife. The harmony that once defined the library's vision had been replaced by rivalries, not just between scholars, but between entire communities. The growing spread of new faiths and the tensions between pagans, Jews, and Christians often spilled into violence. To speak of philosophy during such times was not just an academic exercise, but a risk. Her presence, as both a philosopher and a woman, became charged with symbolism. To some, she embodied reason and continuity with the classical past. To others, she represented resistance to the changing tides of belief and authority. And in such a world, symbols were both celebrated and feared. Her days were filled with teaching, advising, and writing. The texts that she worked on, whether commentaries or original thoughts, became bridges for generations that followed. She did not only preserve ideas, she refined them, made them more accessible, and carried them forward. Her classroom was not limited to the four walls of a building. Leaders, officials, and thinkers sought her counsel. It was in these moments that her influence reached beyond academia and into the very heart of the city's politics, though she herself never sought to play the role of politician. Instead, she lived as a philosopher who understood that wisdom could guide action, and that ideas could steady societies trembling under pressure. It is important to understand how rare such a path was. In a society where the expected destiny of a woman was largely marriage and motherhood, to stand as a public teacher of philosophy was radical. Her decision was not just personal ambition, it was defiance. Yet it was a defiance without arrogance. She was known for her dignity, her humility, and her respect for students and peers. She clothed herself not in ornament, but in simplicity, as if to remind all who listened that truth did not need embellishment. Her life became a kind of quiet protest against the roles imposed upon women, showing by example that intellect had no gender. Still, Alexandria was not a city that tolerated neutrality for long. The growing rivalries between those who clung to the old gods and those who embraced the new faith of Christianity created a landscape where philosophy itself became politicized. To speak with reason, to defend the teachings of Plato or Aristotle, was no longer simply a matter of thought, but of allegiance. And she, with her reputation for wisdom, became a figure around whom suspicion gathered. Her very presence unsettled some, for she symbolized an alternative to the rising orthodoxy, a reminder of a world that many wished to leave behind. The whispers about her grew, first as admiration, then as envy, and finally as accusation. It was said she stood in the way of leaders, that she counseled those who resisted certain powers, that her influence was a threat to the unity sought by ambitious men. Whether these claims were true or not mattered little in the face of fear and rivalry. For when a woman of reason stands in a world of growing zeal, her very existence can be recast as opposition. And so, what began as quiet teachings in Alexandria's halls became fuel for one of history's darker turns. Her story, though marked by tragedy, was not diminished by it. If anything, the violence that ended her life only deepened her legacy. For centuries after, her name would be remembered not just as that of a philosopher, but as a martyr for reason, a woman who dared to stand in the public square of ideas when others insisted she should remain silent. The brilliance of Alexandria's past, so often reduced to the library and its loss, found in her a human embodiment, the living spirit of inquiry, courage, and defiance. To understand her is to understand the fragility of wisdom in times of conflict, but also its endurance. Empires rose and fell, beliefs clashed and reformed, and cities crumbled and were rebuilt. Yet her name remained, whispered by those who saw in her story the timeless struggle between knowledge and ignorance, between freedom and control, between courage and fear. And in those whispers, the beginning we spoke of in Alexandria's glory found its human form, a reminder that even in the most turbulent of times, the light of thought can shine through one person, unexpected and unforgettable. Her beginnings were shaped within the walls of a household unlike many others in Alexandria, a home where knowledge was not only respected, but treated as life's most precious inheritance. Hypatia was born into an age when the city still carried the remnants of its past grandeur, though its library was no longer the invincible beacon it once had been. Yet Alexandria remained a center of learning, where philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy continued to thrive in the minds of those who valued thought above power. Within this atmosphere, Hypatia was nurtured by her father, Theon, who was himself a philosopher and mathematician of distinction. He was not among the most dazzling of thinkers by the standards of the time, but he was careful, methodical, and deeply committed to preserving and transmitting knowledge. Theon worked as a commentator on earlier texts, ensuring that the brilliance of predecessors such as Ptolemy and Euclid would not be lost. His painstaking efforts gave his daughter a foundation of clarity and discipline, for he did not see her as merely an assistant or an observer, but as a mind equal in potential to any man's. To be raised under Theon's instruction meant that Hypatia was exposed early to subjects that most girls of her era would never hear discussed in their presence. Where many daughters of Alexandria learned the domestic arts or the basic skills required for survival in society, Hypatia was guided into the abstractions of mathematics, the precision of astronomy, and the complexities of philosophy. Theon understood the radical nature of what he was doing, yet he also recognized that his daughter's brilliance justified it. He trained her to master not only the content of texts, but also the art of questioning them, of probing the limits of their arguments, and of searching for truth beyond the words on the page. Her education did not stop at home. The intellectual climate of Alexandria provided her with opportunities to observe, listen, and later participate in the vibrant exchanges of scholars. In time, she would surpass her father, for where Theon preserved, Hypatia created. While Theon's legacy was largely that of a diligent scholar who ensured the survival of knowledge, Hypatia's legacy would be that of a thinker who reanimated it, transforming learning into something vital for her age. From the beginning, this difference between them set her apart. She was not satisfied with the simple repetition of ancient wisdom. She sought to apply it, to refine it, and to bring it into dialogue with the pressing concerns of her own time. Her early contributions revealed not only a mind capable of precision, but one capable of vision. She wrote commentaries that made complex mathematical works more accessible, not by diluting them, but by clarifying their reasoning. Such tasks required not only technical skill, but also patience and creativity. Through her work, the ideas of earlier thinkers reached new audiences and endured longer than they might have without her touch. In this way, Hypatia became more than a transmitter of knowledge. She became its guardian and its advocate. To study her early efforts is to see a woman determined not just to enter the halls of learning, but to strengthen their very foundations. Among the many branches of knowledge that drew her attention, Neoplatonism stood out as her philosophical core. Neoplatonism, which had developed in the centuries after Plato, was a system of thought that emphasized the existence of a single ultimate reality, often described as the One, from which all else flowed. It sought to explain the relationship between the divine and the material, the eternal and the temporal, through layers of being and stages of the soul's ascent. Hypatia immersed herself in this tradition, mastering its complexities while giving it a clarity that appealed to her students. She was not content merely to recite the words of earlier Neoplatonists. She sought to live them, to embody philosophy as a way of life rather than as an abstract exercise. Her lectures reflected this, for she taught not only with intellectual rigor, but with moral example. Her command of Neoplatonism gave her a position of unusual influence, but her brilliance was not confined to philosophy alone. Hypatia extended her mastery to astronomy and mathematics, disciplines that in her time were deeply intertwined with philosophical inquiry. To her, studying the heavens was not simply about predicting planetary movements or calculating eclipses, though she was capable of both. It was about recognizing order in the cosmos and aligning the human mind with that order. Mathematics, for her, was not a dry collection of formulas, but a language that expressed the harmony of existence. By teaching and refining mathematical ideas, she offered her students not only tools for calculation, but insights into the deeper structure of reality. Her achievements in mathematics included her work on the study of conic sections, which had been developed centuries earlier by Apollonius. By commenting on and clarifying these texts, she ensured their survival into later generations, influencing the course of mathematical thought well beyond her lifetime. She also improved instruments such as the astrolabe, a device used to observe the heavens and measure the positions of stars and planets. These contributions, though often overlooked in the shadow of her tragic end, were proof of her technical skill and her ability to bridge theory with practice. In the classroom, Hypatia's presence was nothing short of transformative. Students from various backgrounds gathered to hear her words, drawn not only by her intellect, but by her character. She did not present herself with ostentation or vanity. Her attire was plain, her demeanor calm, and her teaching infused with dignity. She embodied the philosopher's life, showing through her simplicity and discipline that truth was not found in wealth or status, but in clarity of thought and purity of conduct. In this way, she became a model for her students, who carried her teachings far beyond Alexandria's walls. Her mastery of astronomy allowed her to speak of the cosmos with authority at a time when understanding the heavens was seen as a way of connecting the human with the divine. The calculations she performed and the instruments she refined demonstrated that knowledge could be both theoretical and practical. To her, there was no division between the philosopher who contemplates and the scientist who measures. Both were united in their search for order and meaning. This holistic approach distinguished her from others who limited themselves to narrow domains. She understood that to grasp the fullness of truth, one must be willing to traverse multiple fields, weaving them into a single fabric of understanding. What made her stand out was not only her mastery of subjects that were considered beyond the reach of women, but also the way she commanded respect from men who might otherwise have dismissed her. In a society where women were often excluded from public intellectual life, Hypatia not only entered it but led within it. She lectured openly, advised political leaders, and engaged with questions that shaped her city's destiny. Her authority was not granted to her by title or position. It was earned by the force of her mind and the strength of her character. Her life was also marked by an unusual independence. Unlike many women of her time, she did not marry, choosing instead to devote herself entirely to philosophy and teaching. This decision, radical for her era, symbolized her commitment to a higher calling. It also freed her from constraints that might have silenced or limited her, allowing her to shape her destiny as few women could. Her celibacy was not merely a personal choice but a philosophical one, reflecting the Neoplatonic belief that the pursuit of truth required the soul to rise above physical attachments. In this, she lived her philosophy as fully as she taught it. The presence of such a woman in Alexandria was extraordinary, and her influence grew as her reputation spread. She became a trusted advisor to figures of power, including the governor Orestes, who valued her counsel in matters of both philosophy and politics. This role extended her reach beyond the classroom, making her not only a teacher of students but a guide to leaders. Yet with influence came danger, for in a city riven by conflict, to be aligned with one faction was to invite suspicion from another. Hypatia's closeness to Orestes would, in time, be used against her, though she herself sought no political gain. Her early life and career, forged under the guidance of her father and shaped by her own determination, reveal a woman who was not content to follow the paths laid out for her, but who carved her own. She rose to prominence not through inheritance or privilege, but through dedication, brilliance, and courage. In doing so, she became not just the daughter of a scholar, but a scholar in her own right, surpassing Theon and becoming one of the most celebrated thinkers of her age. Her journey from student to teacher, from daughter to philosopher, was a testament to the transformative power of education and the resilience of a mind committed to truth. Her story during these years reminds us that brilliance is not confined to time or gender, that in the midst of a society hesitant to grant her a voice, she raised one that could not be ignored. The daughter of genius became a genius herself, weaving together philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics into a legacy that would outlast the storms of her city and the violence that would later engulf her. At this stage of her life, the whispers of Alexandria that had once seemed to foreshadow her rise grew louder, carrying her name far beyond the walls of her home, into the annals of history where she would be remembered not simply as Theon's child, but as Hypatia, a mind as radiant as the city that shaped her. The life of Hypatia unfolded into a role that was not only rare for her time, but extraordinary even by the standards of any age. She did not remain in the shadow of her father's teachings, nor was she content to work quietly in the margins of scholarship. Instead, she stepped fully into the public sphere as a teacher and philosopher in her own right. Alexandria had seen many voices rise and fall in its long history, but few commanded such attention and respect as hers. By the time she matured into her role, the city had already been marked by centuries of intellectual brilliance and cultural blending. What she offered was not only continuation but renewal, a revival of its intellectual heart during a period when turmoil and division threatened to silence reason. Her presence in the lecture halls of Alexandria was something unforgettable. Students gathered from across the Mediterranean, drawn not merely by the novelty of a woman philosopher, but by the substance of her teachings. These halls were not confined to small, private groups, but extended into larger public spaces where men of rank, wealth, and ambition listened to her words. The setting of her lectures carried the weight of tradition, echoing the great schools of Athens and Rome, yet the sight of Hypatia at the center, commanding the attention of all who entered, was something strikingly new. She did not inherit her position by default. She claimed it through the authority of her intellect, the discipline of her method, and the clarity of her expression. For her students, Hypatia became more than a teacher. She was a living embodiment of the philosophical life. To study with her was not only to acquire technical knowledge of mathematics or astronomy, but to be initiated into a way of thinking that sought harmony between the soul and the cosmos. She taught them to question, to analyze, and to seek truth without fear. Her influence cut across lines of background, faith, and status. Pagans, Jews, and Christians alike came to her, for wisdom was not bound to one creed, and Hypatia herself did not impose barriers on who could learn. This inclusivity gave her teaching a remarkable power in a city increasingly divided by religious tensions. In her classroom, the world could still appear unified under the banner of inquiry and truth. The diversity of her students only magnified her legacy. Some went on to occupy important positions of influence, carrying her lessons into politics, administration, and other centers of power. Others spread her reputation by recounting the depth of her knowledge and the clarity of her teaching. For them, Hypatia was not simply an instructor of facts, but a guide who gave them tools to live and to think in a world that was rapidly changing. She shaped generations of thinkers who, directly or indirectly, carried pieces of her wisdom into the future. Her work extended beyond the lecture hall. Among her greatest contributions was her effort to refine and update astronomical tables, which were essential not only for scientific purposes, but also for navigation, timekeeping, and even religious practice. These tables traced back to earlier works, including those of Ptolemy, and carried immense importance for understanding the movement of planets and stars. Hypatia's revisions and clarifications allowed this knowledge to remain practical and relevant for her contemporaries. She did not treat astronomy as a mere curiosity, but as a discipline intimately connected with daily life and human understanding of the universe. Alongside these tables, she is also credited with contributions to the improvement or even invention of scientific instruments. Accounts suggest her involvement with the astrolabe, a device used to calculate the position of celestial bodies. The astrolabe was both a scientific tool and a symbol of humanity's effort to grasp the heavens, and Hypatia's hand in its refinement reflects her ability to bridge theory with practice. Other sources describe her work on the hydroscope, an instrument used to measure the density of liquids, revealing her interest in the natural world beyond the stars. These inventions, whether entirely new or perfected under her guidance, show that Hypatia was not confined to abstract philosophy, but was deeply engaged with the practical challenges of science. The dual nature of her work is part of what made her so influential. She embodied the philosopher's vision of unity between knowledge and life. She could write a commentary on mathematical texts that clarified obscure arguments, yet she could also demonstrate how an instrument might aid in exploration or daily practice. She lived at the crossroads of ideas and applications, embodying the belief that wisdom was not only to be contemplated, but to be lived and used. In doing so, she made philosophy and science accessible, not just to scholars in ivory towers, but to leaders, sailors, merchants, and all who relied on a clearer understanding of their world. Hypatia's lectures carried a particular force not only because of their content, but because of the way she delivered them. Contemporary accounts describe her as calm, dignified, and persuasive, a speaker whose words commanded both respect and inspiration. She did not adorn her teachings with excessive ornamentation, but spoke plainly and directly, embodying the very clarity she sought in thought. To her students, she was more than an authority figure. She was an example of philosophy made flesh. Her lifestyle reflected the discipline she taught, for she rejected excess, chose simplicity in clothing, and presented herself as a philosopher first and foremost. This consistency between her life and her words gave her immense credibility and made her presence magnetic. It is remarkable to consider that in an age where women were so often denied public voice, Hypatia did not merely find one, but carried it into the most public of spaces. She advised political leaders, engaged in discussions that shaped civic life, and stood before assemblies of men who might have expected her silence. Instead, they found themselves listening, persuaded by her arguments, and influenced by her wisdom. In a world where the line between philosophy and politics was thin, Hypatia stood at the center of both, though always as a philosopher, never as a politician. She sought not power for herself, but clarity and guidance for others. Her growing prominence placed her in a delicate position. To the admirers who gathered around her, she was a symbol of reason and renewal, the matriarch of Alexandria's intellectual revival. To others, however, her visibility and influence represented a threat. The very qualities that drew students of diverse faiths also made her a figure around whom suspicion could gather in a time of mounting religious conflict. Still, her life during this period demonstrates the extraordinary reach of her influence, and through her teaching, her writings, and her inventions, Hypatia revived a spirit of learning that Alexandria desperately needed. She reminded the city of what it had once been, and what it could still aspire to be. Her work in refining the tools of astronomy and mathematics, her guidance of students across backgrounds, and her commanding presence as a lecturer all combined to give her a place among the greatest minds of her age. Yet her story was not simply one of intellectual triumph. It was also a story of courage. For every lecture she gave, every table she updated, and every student she welcomed was an act of defiance against the silence imposed on women and the fear imposed by zealotry. She was an unseen matriarch in the sense that she did not claim the authority of political office or religious title. Her authority was instead rooted in the intangible yet undeniable power of knowledge. Through her mind, she ruled a kingdom not bounded by walls but by ideas, a realm where those who entered found themselves elevated by her wisdom. In this way, Hypatia led Alexandria not by decree but by influence, not by force but by thought. She reminded her city of its own identity, of the greatness it once carried, and of the light that could still shine amid its divisions. The revival she inspired was fragile, for it depended on a balance that Alexandria was struggling to maintain. Yet even as tensions deepened, Hypatia's presence affirmed that learning could still flourish, that dialogue could still bridge divides, and that reason could still guide action. She lived not only as a teacher of philosophy, but as its guardian, the last great voice of a city that had once been the world's most brilliant center of knowledge. Her students carried her lessons beyond her life, and through them, her legacy endured. At this stage in her journey, Hypatia's role was clear. She was no longer simply the daughter of Theon, nor merely a commentator or mathematician. She had become a leader of minds, the matriarch of a community bound not by blood or creed, but by the shared pursuit of truth. Her voice carried across Alexandria, echoing through lecture halls, whispered in streets, and remembered in the lives of those she taught. It was a voice that revived the city's intellectual spirit even as storms gathered on its horizon, and it was a voice that would not be forgotten, even when silence was forced upon it. The Alexandria that Hypatia came to lead as an intellectual force was not the same Alexandria that had once been envisioned as a harmonious meeting place of cultures. The city, founded centuries earlier by Alexander and shaped by the ambitions of the Ptolemies, had always lived with tension. Greeks and Egyptians, Romans and Jews, pagans and Christians had long contended for dominance in its streets and institutions. But in the time of Hypatia, those tensions deepened into dangerous conflicts, fanned by the growing struggle between faith and reason, and between old traditions and new authorities. The city that had once been a symbol of learning now became a battlefield for ideology, and Hypatia, whether she wished it or not, stood at the very center. By the early 5th century of the Common Era, Christianity had moved from being a persecuted faith to becoming a dominant force within the Roman Empire. The emperors themselves had embraced the cross, and bishops held influence that rivaled governors. Pagan temples, once filled with worshippers, began to fall silent. Statues of gods were toppled, rituals banned, and the festivals that had marked the calendar for generations were erased. Alexandria, with its long pagan heritage and its deep Jewish traditions, became a place where this transformation was especially violent. For those who clung to the old ways, the rise of Christianity felt like an assault on their very identity. For those who embraced the new faith, the presence of pagan scholars and rituals seemed like an intolerable obstacle to the triumph of truth. The city became a place where rival crowds clashed in the streets, where mobs stormed synagogues, and where debates over theology could quickly turn into bloodshed. Political leaders were forced to take sides, and those who tried to balance between factions often found themselves distrusted by all. Into this atmosphere of suspicion and violence, Hypatia carried herself as a philosopher, committed not to power but to truth. Yet her very commitment to reason placed her at odds with the growing tide of zealotry. Her lectures, which once drew students of many backgrounds, began to acquire a symbolic weight. To sit at her feet was to declare, at least implicitly, that one valued philosophy as a higher guide than dogma. To seek her counsel, as the governor Orestes did, was to risk being accused of standing against the church. Her fame, once her strength, became a vulnerability, for she was no longer seen only as a teacher, but as a figure embodying resistance to the new order. In a city where symbols mattered as much as reality, Hypatia's very existence became charged with political meaning. She represented, for many, the survival of Hellenic thought. Her mastery of Plato, Aristotle, and the Neoplatonists tied her to a tradition that Christianity was eager to eclipse. To the faithful who believed that the triumph of the Church required the silencing of pagan voices, she appeared as one of the last and most dangerous remnants of the old world. It did not matter that she herself was not openly hostile to Christianity, nor that she welcomed Christian students into her lectures. What mattered was what she symbolized: the persistence of intellectual freedom, the refusal to let reason be swallowed by zeal, and the continuity of a tradition that refused to die quietly. This symbolic power grew more dangerous as her influence extended beyond the classroom. Orestes, the imperial governor of Alexandria, valued Hypatia's wisdom and often sought her counsel. His position was already precarious, caught between loyalty to imperial authority and the rising dominance of Bishop Cyril, the Christian leader of the city. To stand close to Hypatia, a pagan philosopher, made Orestes vulnerable to accusations of being an enemy of the church. To some of Cyril's supporters, it seemed obvious that she was the reason Orestes resisted ecclesiastical power. They began to whisper that Hypatia was not merely a philosopher, but a sorceress, a woman using pagan magic to thwart the will of God. In this way, her reputation was twisted into a weapon against her. The dignity and brilliance that had once inspired all were reinterpreted as signs of arrogance, pride, and dangerous influence. The purity with which she had lived her life, choosing celibacy and devoting herself to truth, became reimagined as a mask for subversion. The very tools of philosophy, once symbols of clarity, were recast as instruments of deception. As tension between Orestes and Cyril grew, the figure of Hypatia loomed larger in the imagination of the city. To those who longed for peace, she was a mediator of wisdom. To those who sought dominance, she was a barrier to be removed. The streets of Alexandria told the story of this tension in ways that books could not. Processions of monks marched in defense of the bishop, while pagan remnants tried to keep alive their fading rituals. The Jewish community, long established in the city, found itself caught in the middle, facing both persecution and retaliation. Mobs, often fueled by rumors, acted with brutal speed, and authorities struggled to maintain order. In this climate, a philosopher who continued to speak openly, who drew crowds of students, and who advised political leaders could not escape attention. Hypatia did not retreat into silence, though she must have known the dangers she faced. She continued to teach, to write, and to guide, her life becoming an act of defiance simply by continuing unchanged. Her commitment to reason was absolute, and she would not surrender the philosopher's role even as the ground beneath her feet shifted into peril. In doing so, she became more than a teacher of mathematics or astronomy. She became the embodiment of intellectual freedom itself. Her presence reminded Alexandria that knowledge could not be erased by decree, nor truth silenced by force. But symbols can be dangerous. The more she stood for freedom, the more she threatened those who sought control. The more she embodied reason, the more she attracted the wrath of zeal. Her life became a fault line where the city's divisions converged. The growing hostility between Orestes and Cyril, between civic authority and ecclesiastical power, seemed to crystallize around her. Rumors grew darker, the whispers sharper, and her name was spoken not only with admiration but with venom. It is impossible to know whether Hypatia herself understood the scale of what was building against her. Perhaps she believed, as philosophers often do, that truth would prevail over fear. Perhaps she hoped that her simplicity of life and clarity of teaching would shield her from malice. Or perhaps she knew, but refused to yield, believing that to live in silence was worse than to die for philosophy. Whatever she thought, the city was moving toward a moment when her fate would no longer rest in her own hands. Alexandria, once the jewel of learning, now stood at a crossroads where faith and reason collided with deadly force. Hypatia's story became the story of that conflict, a symbol of what was at stake in an age where the freedom to question was increasingly seen as a threat. The suspense of her final days builds not from sudden betrayal, but from the slow tightening of forces around her. The rise of zealotry, the weakness of imperial authority, the suspicion cast on her friendships, and the inability of wisdom to shield itself against violence. She walked through the city she loved, still teaching, still advising, still embodying the philosopher's life, even as the storm gathered. Each lecture, each meeting with Orestes, each word spoken in defense of reason became more dangerous than the last. In her, the old Alexandria lived, but around her, a new order was rising, one less tolerant of voices like hers. The tragedy was not sudden but inevitable, the culmination of years of tension between faith and philosophy. And so, as the city moved closer to its breaking point, Hypatia's figure stood luminous and vulnerable. She was admired, hated, respected, feared, and ultimately targeted. Her presence was no longer neutral, it was incendiary. She had become the center of Alexandria's most dangerous question. Could reason survive in an age ruled by zeal? The answer would soon come, written not in words or numbers but in blood. The story of Hypatia did not end in the streets of Alexandria on the day her life was torn from her. Her death was violent, humiliating, and tragic, but it was not the conclusion of her meaning. If anything, the brutality of her end ensured that her voice would echo far beyond the city where she once lectured and lived. For centuries her memory has returned, sometimes cloaked in myth, sometimes drawn upon for political or cultural struggles, but always as a reminder of what is at stake when knowledge and freedom confront fear and zealotry. Her legacy, though born of pain, has remained undimmed, for it speaks to questions that every age must face. Her life had embodied the idea that truth must be sought without fear of consequence. She did not bend to the restrictions of gender, nor did she hide her pursuit of knowledge to placate authority. She walked in public, spoke before men of power, taught those who would listen, and lived in a way that declared the mind as free as the stars she charted. Her death, orchestrated by those who saw in her a threat, symbolized the dangers that await those who challenge dogma with reason. Yet even as her killers sought to silence her, they ensured her immortality, for what they destroyed in body, they preserved in symbol. Hypatia became, and remains, the emblem of intellectual freedom in its purest form. Her story forces us to look not only at the past, but at ourselves. When we reflect on her life, we are reminded that the struggle for knowledge has never been smooth, and that truth has always had enemies. There is a long history of thinkers, scientists, and reformers who have faced suspicion, exile, or death for daring to ask questions that others found threatening. Hypatia stands among them, one of the earliest martyrs not for a faith, but for philosophy itself. She reminds us that the defense of reason and inquiry is never without cost, but also that such defense is necessary if societies are to move forward. Her relevance to the modern world is striking. Consider intellectual freedom. In her age, to stand for philosophy against zeal was to risk one's life. In ours, though the threats may not always come with mobs in the streets, the forces that oppose free thought remain. Censorship, suppression of dissent, the manipulation of information, and the intimidation of thinkers still mark the landscape of our world. Each time a journalist is silenced, each time a scientist is dismissed for inconvenient findings, each time a teacher is threatened for what they teach, we are reminded that the struggle that claimed Hypatia is not over. Her example asks us whether we are willing to defend truth even when it is unpopular, whether we will protect reason when others call for silence. She also speaks to the question of gender equality. In a time when women were expected to remain hidden within the domestic sphere, she walked openly into the heart of public intellectual life. She claimed authority not by marriage, not by title, but by the power of her mind. She lived a life that said, in its very existence, that knowledge belongs to all and that the soul has no gender. The barriers she faced and overcame remain familiar to us today, though in different forms. Women in science, mathematics, and philosophy still find themselves contending with biases, doubts, and obstacles placed in their path. Each time a young woman chooses to pursue physics, or engineering, or philosophy against the expectations of her society, She is walking the path that Hypatia cleared. Remembering her is not simply a matter of honoring the past. It is an act of inspiration for the present, a reminder that talent and wisdom know no boundaries. Scientific inquiry, too, finds in her a patron. She refined the tools of astronomy, clarified the texts of mathematics, and insisted that knowledge should not only be preserved but advanced. She showed that theory and practice are not enemies but partners, and that the pursuit of the heavens and the study of nature are part of the same quest for order and meaning. Today, when science often finds itself questioned or politicized, when discoveries are resisted because they disrupt comfort or power, her life offers a warning and a call. To reject inquiry is to retreat into darkness, but to embrace it is to honor what is most human in us. Hypatia's instruments may be long gone, her tables surpassed by modern data, but the spirit that guided her work is alive in every telescope, every laboratory, every classroom where curiosity still burns. The brutality of her end should not be forgotten, but neither should it be the final word. The mob that dragged her from her chariot, that stripped and killed her, believed they were ending her influence. Instead, they preserved it forever. By destroying her body, they gave birth to her myth, and that myth has outlived empires. Her death is a warning about what fear can do, but her life is a greater testament to what courage can achieve. Each time we choose openness over silence, curiosity over complacency, or reason over zeal, we carry her forward. In reflecting on Hypatia, we also confront the fragility of knowledge itself. Libraries can burn, books can be banned, teachers can be silenced, but ideas, once spoken and lived, are harder to erase. Hypatia's writings may be lost, her instruments scattered, yet her story survives, and with it the ideas she cherished. The survival of her name reminds us that while ignorance may triumph in moments, truth has the patience of centuries. She is proof that the human spirit, once kindled, cannot be extinguished by violence alone. Her story also serves as a bridge across time. In an era when divisions of religion, culture, and politics threatened to shatter her world, she insisted on a space where minds could meet, where questions could be asked freely, and where truth could be pursued without fear. In our world, too, divisions run deep. We face polarization, mistrust, and hostility across communities and nations. Hypatia's classroom, where pagans and Christians sat side by side, reminds us that dialogue is possible, and that in the pursuit of knowledge we may find a unity deeper than our differences. To remember Hypatia is not only to recall a woman of the past, but to celebrate a symbol for the future. She matters because she reminds us of the cost of freedom and the worth of defending it. She matters because she embodies the courage to step beyond imposed boundaries, to live fully according to one's mind and conscience. She matters because her life tells us that knowledge, once pursued honestly, can outlast the violence of its enemies. We live in a time when it is easy to forget those who came before, when the flood of present concerns overwhelms our memory of history. But Hypatia calls us to remember. To forget her is to risk repeating the mistake that killed her, the mistake of fearing knowledge and silencing voices. To remember her is to choose differently, to honor reason, to protect inquiry, to uplift those who dare to question. Her name should not lie in the shadows of footnotes, but shine as a beacon for all who believe in truth. Her life and death speak across the centuries with a power that demands more than passive admiration. It demands action. It demands that we defend intellectual freedom wherever it is threatened, that we fight for gender equality wherever it is denied, that we pursue science even when it unsettles, and that we honor those who, like her, refuse to bow before fear. Every classroom that values questions, every laboratory that resists suppression, every mind that refuses to surrender to ignorance is part of her legacy. And so, we end where we began, in the city of Alexandria, where the whispers of thought once filled its streets. The lighthouse has fallen, the library is gone, but the memory of Hypatia endures. She was not a queen or a general, not a conqueror or a saint, but her impact has outlived many who bore those titles. She was a philosopher, a mathematician, an astronomer, a teacher, and above all, a defender of the mind's freedom. Her brilliance, though silenced by violence, continues to shine, for ideas once born are not so easily destroyed. To speak her name is to recall the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between truth and fear, between freedom and control. It is to take a side in that struggle, to declare that knowledge is worth defending, that reason is worth preserving, and that courage is worth honoring. Hypatia still matters because we still need her. And as long as there are those who dare to think, to question, and to dream. Her legacy